Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow walk through something a little strange, a little unsettling, but also oddly relaxing. So settle in. Dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, and let your mind wander. Because tonight's subject is the quiet afterlife of battlefield bones. We usually think of great battles as moments of thunder and fire, swords clashing, cannons roaring, banners waving dramatically in the wind. And then when the dust clears, the story moves on. The kings sign treaties, historians write about tactics, and the paintings go up in museums. But what about the soldiers themselves? Or, more specifically, what about the bones they left behind? Because here's the thing, bodies don't just disappear after a war. Thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, are left lying in fields, woods, and riverbanks. And in the centuries before organized war graves, people had to figure out what to do with them. The solutions were, let's say, creative. Sometimes respectful, often practical, and occasionally just plain weird. So tonight we're going to drift across centuries and continents, calmly tracing the strange journeys of those bones. Some were ground down and scattered over farmland. Some were stacked into decorative walls. Others became relics, souvenirs, or even medicine. Yes, medicine. Because if you've ever wondered whether your great-great-something grandfather ended up sprinkled over a potato field or swallowed in powdered form by a nervous Renaissance nobleman, well, the answer might actually be yes. Let's ease into this with the simplest scenario. Imagine a medieval battlefield, let's say northern France, around the year 1350. The 100 Years' War is in full swing, and thousands of men are cut down in just a few hours. When the noise fades, you're left with acres of corpses. And here's the problem bearing that many people takes time, energy, and a lot of shovels, which peasants, conveniently, did not have in abundance. So often, the bodies just lay there. Sometimes a few shallow trenches were dug, but more often than not, soldiers were left above ground. Over time, the flesh rotted away. Scavengers picked over the remains, and bleached bones were left scattered like driftwood. Travelers decades later would still describe stepping over skulls on their way across old battlefields. It wasn't a dignified end. It was just messy, inconvenient, and, depending on the season, probably very smelly. But once the bones dried out, people discovered they could be useful. And this is where the real afterlife begins. By the early modern period, Europe had developed an appetite for bones, literally. Starting in the Renaissance, powdered bone called mumia was sold in apothecaries as medicine. It was thought to cure headaches, bleeding disorders, epilepsy, and, well, just about anything you could slap a Latin label on. Now, technically, mumia was supposed to come from embalmed Egyptian mummies. But when imports were scarce or expensive, local bones worked just fine. And what's more convenient than a battlefield, already littered with sun-bleached skeletons. So yes, some soldiers ended up bottled on a pharmacy shelf. Imagine dying nobly in battle only to spend your second act crushed into dust and stirred into someone's wine. That's the Renaissance for you. And if that wasn't odd enough, bones also had industrial value. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries. Europe's population is booming, agriculture is expanding, and everyone is desperate for better fertilizer. Enter bones. Rich in phosphate, they could be ground into powder and spread over fields to make crops grow. Which was great, except that some of the biggest suppliers of bones were battlefields. Take Waterloo, for example. In 1815, tens of thousands of men and horses died in a single day. By the 1820s, scavengers were digging up the remains and carting them off to bone mills in England. The ground bones were sold to farmers who happily sprinkled them over their fields. The cycle of war and agriculture was complete. Your ancestor might have died fighting Napoleon, but by the next spring he was helping fertilize somebody's turnips. Romantic, in its own grim little way. And it wasn't just fertilizer. Bones were used to make glue, buttons, even fine porcelain. Bone china, as the name suggests, sometimes included actual human bone in the mix. Picture yourself sipping politely from a delicate teacup. blissfully unaware that it contained fragments of a Bavarian infantryman. History has a sense of irony like that, but medieval people weren't just practical with bones. They were also artistic. Too many skeletons piling up. The solution was ossuaries bone houses. You've probably seen the famous one in Sedlec, in the Czech Republic, where skulls are stacked into walls, chandeliers, and garlands. But ossuaries weren't unique to Sedlec. Across Europe, battlefields, plague pits, and overstuffed cemeteries led to surpluses of bones. Churches often gathered them up and arranged them neatly in crypts. To modernize, they look eerie. But at the time, it was considered both pious and efficient. Why waste space on individual graves when you can decorate a chapel with thousands of skulls? Death, after all, was everywhere in medieval life. Why not lean into the aesthetic? Of course, not every pile of bones was treated so carefully. Victorious armies sometimes used skulls as trophies. The Mongols were famous for piling them into pyramids outside conquered cities. Europeans, being slightly more restrained, liked to mount them on walls. After the Battle of Naumburg in 1021, severed heads decorated the city gates. A few months later, they were less intimidating and more like a collection of badly maintained pumpkins. But the point was made, and bones didn't always stay in one piece. In some cases, royal or noble bodies killed in battle were boiled down. This might sound horrifying, but the idea was practical. Boiling stripped away the flesh, leaving clean bones that could be transported easily for burial at home. Because nothing says, "We loved you, sire," like simmering you in a giant cauldron. It was called mos teutonicus, the German custom, and was especially popular for nobles who died abroad. They might have lost the war, but at least they could come home, eventually in neatly packaged skeletal form. Meanwhile, tourists of the 18th and 19th centuries loved battlefield bones as souvenirs. Travelers to Waterloo, for instance, often pocketed fragments of skulls or teeth as mementos. Local farmers even used bones to patch fences. Imagine leaning casually against a fence post, then realizing it was once a French grenadier. Efficient, yes. Dignified, not so much. By the Victorian period, bones became museum pieces. Skeletons from famous battles were collected, labeled, and displayed behind glass, usually with a lot more confidence than accuracy. Some were advertised as the skeleton of a noble knight, when in reality they were probably just unlucky peasants. But Victorians adored a good macabre exhibit. Nothing like a field trip to look at someone's ribcage. So you can see the pattern. Bones weren't treated as silent remains. They were raw material, practical, symbolic, decorative, even edible. And their journeys didn't stop when the fighting did. Let's pause here and take a breath. Picture those rolling green fields of Europe today. Peaceful, quiet, dotted with cows. Underneath, layers of history are still there. Skulls, femurs, teethsome resting, some long ago scattered into porcelain teacups or potato fields. It's strange, it's unsettling, but it's also just very human. We've always been creative recyclers, and bones were no exception. In the next stretch, we'll drift further into specifics. How bones became relics, how saintly remains blurred into battlefield collections, and how entire towns made side businesses out of harvesting skeletons. But for now, just rest with the thought. When wars ended, the soldiers' stories didn't. Their bones went on living quiet second lives. So let's float further into this strange topic. We've already seen bones scattered, sold, and ground into powder. But not every skeleton ended up as fertilizer. Some bones went in the opposite direction. Instead of being recycled for crops, they were elevated into relics, honored and displayed. Because in the Middle Ages, bones were not just bones. They could be sacred. They could be powerful. And depending on who you asked, they could work miracles. The medieval church had a thing for bones, especially saintly ones. Relics were the ultimate spiritual status symbol. Having a saint's finger bone or skull fragment could turn a small church into a major pilgrimage site. Pilgrims meant donations, and donations meant money. which meant relics were not just holy, they were profitable. Now, the problem was saints were in limited supply, and the demand for relics was enormous. So the line between battlefield bones and saintly relics sometimes blurred. A pile of anonymous skeletons might quietly donate a few ribs or teeth to the reliquary market. No one was going to run a DNA test in the 12th century. And let's be honest, if a bishop said the bone was holy, who was going to argue? This is how entire skeletons of saints were sometimes cobbled together from battlefield leftovers. You might have a skull from one person, femurs from another, and a rib cage from a third, all sewn into a neat skeleton dressed in gold and jewels. To a sleepy pilgrim squinting by candlelight, it looked divine enough. And if the relic attracted enough visitors, no one was going to check the paperwork. But relics weren't just fakes. Sometimes actual soldiers' bones were revered in their own right. For example, after the Crusades, bones of fallen knights were occasionally brought home and enshrined in churches. They weren't technically saints, but their deaths in holy war made them quasi-sacred. A knight's skull might end up in a gilded reliquary, kissed by generations of parishioners, long after his name was forgotten. Meanwhile, bones also became monuments, whole piles of them. Across Europe, there are still ossuaries that began with battlefield collections. One of the most famous is the Du Mont Ossuary near Verdun in France. It houses the remains of over 130 soldiers from World War I. Inside, bones are stacked in chambers, visible through small windows. It's quiet, solemn, and unsettling, but this tradition goes back centuries. Medieval towns sometimes built bone chapels specifically to house the remains of wars fought nearby. Now, the aesthetic of these bone chapels is hard to describe. Imagine walking into a church and seeing chandeliers made from pelvises, coats of arms spelled out in tibias, or a full altar framed with skulls. It sounds gothic and spooky to us, but to the people who built them, it was pious. Bones were reminders of mortality. Memento mori. You too will die, so be humble, live well, and maybe donate generously to the church. Nothing inspires generosity quite like sitting under a ceiling made of skulls. And then there were battlefield monuments that weren't quite so sacred. In Eastern Europe, for instance, armies sometimes left piles of skulls as grim warnings. The Ottoman Empire built several towers of skulls out of defeated enemies. The most famous is in Niš, Serbia, where an entire tower was constructed using the skulls of Serbian rebels after the failed uprising of 1809. Each skull was set in mortar, staring out at passers-by. Today, the tower is preserved as a national monument, which is one way to recycle your enemies. Not all skull piles were so organized. Sometimes, locals simply gathered bones into heaps at the edges of fields. Travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries described stumbling across mountains of bones where great battles had taken place. A casual reminder that history was literally underfoot. Now, not everyone appreciated these bone collections. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers were starting to frown at the casual display of human remains. It was seen as unsanitary, old-fashioned, and maybe a little superstitious. But even then, bones didn't just disappear. They were quietly removed from chapels and sold to bone merchants who had plenty of industrial buyers. Once again, war dead ended up in fertilizer mills or porcelain factories. The afterlife of bones was rarely restful. And speaking of restless bones, sometimes they were deliberately disturbed for reasons that had nothing to do with industry. There was a superstition that bones carried power. Powdered skull, for instance, was thought to stop nosebleeds. Ground-up femur could treat gout. And for the truly adventurous, you could stir powdered human bone into your wine as a health tonic. Nothing like a little battlefield seasoning with your evening drink. Let's drift for a moment into the Renaissance. This was the golden age of bone-based medicine. Apothecaries stocked jars of powdered skull, ground mummy, and even human fat. They swore by it. And where supply ran short, they topped it up with whatever they could find. Battlefields were like giant open-air pharmacies. A skull from a fallen soldier could be dried, ground, and labeled mumia, with no one the wiser. Patients, of course, thought they were swallowing the wisdom of ancient Egypt. In reality, they were getting a taste of a French pikeman. And if powdered bones weren't your style, you could always carry a piece of bone as a charm. Soldiers often kept fragments of enemy bones as talismans, believing they offered protection or luck. Others used them as amulets against disease. Superstitious? Absolutely. But in a world where half your friends died of the plague before 30, a little superstition didn't hurt. There's also the quiet irony of how bones, once seen as sacred relics, slowly became mundane commodities. The same femur that might once have been wrapped in gold and placed in a reliquary could, a few centuries later, be crushed into powder and sold to a farmer. Holy one day, fertilizer the next. History has a way of reducing everything to dust, sometimes literally. Let's drift toward the Napoleonic period again, because this is where bones reached peak commercialization. By the 1820s, travelers were shocked by how casually bones were being collected from battlefields like Leipzig, Austerlitz, and Waterloo. There are stories of entire shiploads of bones being exported from Europe to Britain for grinding. Farmers sprinkled them over their fields without a second thought. Which means somewhere in rural England, there were probably potato patches grown entirely on French cavalrymen. A strange sort of revenge harvest. And then, of course, bones became part of national identity. In the 19th century, countries began building official war memorials, and bones were gathered into mass graves with much ceremony. But even then, not all bones made it into the monuments. Many still found their way into the industrial economy, ground down and scattered anonymously across the landscape. For every ossuary filled with carefully labeled remains, there were 10 times as many skeletons quietly sold by local farmers. So, in summary, bones could be holy. They could be trophies, they could be monuments, souvenirs, charms, or medicine. Or they could just be fertilizer. Soldiers went to battle for king and country, but in the long run, they usually served cabbages. Let's float onward. In the next stretch, we'll wander into some very specific stories. Bones that traveled halfway across Europe, skulls mistaken for saints, and the curious Victorian fascination with collecting fragments of battlefields as keepsakes, because apparently nothing says family vacation like a human femur wrapped in newspaper. Let's drift gently into another quietly fascinating aspect of history, the ways people have preserved, collected, and admired objects from the past. Across centuries, humans have always sought connections to history, not as reminders of hardship, but as ways to learn, reflect, and satisfy curiosity. People have long enjoyed collecting objects that carry stories. Small artifacts, commemorative items, and creative reproductions can serve as tangible links to history, offering insight into culture, innovation, and shared experiences. These collections allow us to interact with the past in a calm, reflective way, inviting thoughtful consideration rather than shock or sensationalism. Even before formal museums existed, individuals collected objects of interest from the natural world and human society. During the Renaissance, scholars and travelers gathered minerals, fossils, coins, maps, and small works of art. Cabinets of curiosity or Wunderkammern were arranged with care, often blending scientific specimens with objects that carried historical, artistic, or cultural significance. Visitors to these collections would study each object carefully, not for excitement or fear, but to learn about the world, past civilizations, and human creativity. Some objects were admired for their craftsmanship. Intricate carvings, beautifully minted coins, or elegantly bound manuscripts offered a tactile sense of the past. Each object could tell a story, where it came from, who owned it, or what purpose it served. Collectors delighted in the knowledge that, through their objects, they could touch history directly, bringing abstract concepts to life in a way that books alone could not. During the 18th and 19th centuries, collecting became increasingly associated with education and refinement. Wealthy households maintained elaborate displays combining curiosities from around the world. Maps, scientific specimens, ancient coins, and historical artifacts were arranged in ways that encouraged reflection, discussion, and learning. Families use these collections to educate children, stimulate conversation, and foster curiosity about the past and the wider world. Objects tied to history were particularly valued. Artifacts or reproductions connected to notable figures, cultural milestones, or significant inventions provided a tangible sense of continuity. A small replica of an early mechanical device, a miniature architectural model, or a commemorative medal could spark hours of discussion and reflection. These objects allowed individuals to engage with history personally, bridging centuries with curiosity and imagination. The rise of public museums further expanded access to historical objects. Curators began arranging displays to tell stories rather than simply amass collections. Exhibitions highlighted connections between objects, explaining how they represented cultural, technological, or artistic achievements. Visitors could explore items in context, a model of an important building, a replica of a historical invention, or illustrations depicting past events. Museums also emphasized accuracy and interpretation. Labels, illustrations, and explanatory text guided visitors through the story each object told. Education and reflection were prioritized over spectacle. The objects became teachers themselves, silent, patient, and encouraging careful observation. Even simple items, coins, tools, or printed works offered layers of insight when presented thoughtfully. Enthusiasts often took a creative approach to history. Miniature models, dioramas, and artistic reproductions allowed people to interact with objects in imaginative ways. A scale model of a famous building might inspire reflection on architecture or cultural context. A carefully illustrated historical map could spark curiosity about trade, migration, or technology. Artistic interpretations provided not only visual pleasure but also intellectual engagement, encouraging viewers to think about history dynamically. These creative approaches were not limited to wealthy collectors. Educational societies, local historical groups, and schools encouraged the use of models, maps, and reproductions to teach students about the past. The objects became storytelling tools, linking tangible items to broader narratives about society, innovation, and cultural development. In this way, historical objects fostered both learning and imagination, making history approachable and engaging. Even ordinary households could participate in this culture of historical engagement. Journals, guidebooks, and educational pamphlets suggested ways to observe, collect, and display interesting objects safely. Families might keep small collections alongside books, maps, and illustrations, creating miniature archives of knowledge. Children could explore these collections with guidance, learning about past inventions, cultural practices, or geographic discoveries. Objects became a way to bridge generations, allowing families to share stories about exploration, creativity, and innovation. Through these small collections, history became personal and interactive, encouraging reflection in a quiet, gentle way. One of the remarkable aspects of these collections is how objects act as storytellers. A single coin, carefully displayed, might inspire reflection on commerce, travel, or cultural exchange. A map could spark curiosity about exploration, migration, or urban development. Even a simple model or print might prompt discussion about architecture, design, or artistic style. By engaging with these objects, people were connecting to history directly. They were learning not only about what had happened, but also about how societies interpreted and preserved their past. Collections, models, and educational displays allowed history to become a living conversation rather than a static record. Museums and exhibitions continued to expand the possibilities for safe engagement with historical objects. Curators carefully arranged items to highlight their significance, encouraging reflection on culture, achievement, and human creativity. Visitors could explore technological innovations, architectural feats, artistic developments, or scientific discoveries, all through the lens of tangible artifacts. In many ways, these objects inspired further creativity. Visitors might be motivated to write, sketch, or experiment, using historical objects as springboards for new ideas. Art, literature, and innovation were all enriched by thoughtful engagement with the past. Objects became catalysts for curiosity, exploration, and reflection. Throughout all of this, historical objects transitioned from practical markers of events to symbols of cultural memory. They carried meaning, a reminder of human ingenuity, achievement, and shared experience. Small keepsakes, replicas, and curated displays allowed individuals to engage personally with history, offering reflection and insight in a calm, contemplative way. Collections of artifacts, models, and educational objects also underscore a broader truth. History is about connection. People seek to understand the past, participate in cultural narratives, and preserve knowledge for future generations. Thoughtful curation and creative engagement provide that link, allowing history to become personal, reflective, and meaningful. In a sense, historical objects act as quiet teachers. They invite observation, provoke thought, and encourage curiosity without drama or spectacle. A well-displayed model, an illustration, or a small artifact can carry centuries of cultural meaning in a calm and accessible way. These objects allow history to feel close, understandable, and even comforting. As we continue, we see how objects associated with history evolved into symbols of culture, architecture, and education, shaping the way societies remember and interpret their past. They quietly carry meaning, inviting curiosity, reflection, and a sense of continuity across generations. So, we've seen bones as fertilizer, as souvenirs, and as casual mantelpiece decorations. But bones weren't always treated as throwaway oddities. Sometimes they were elevated into symbols, used in politics, in religion, and occasionally in interior decorating. Because, as strange as it sounds, entire buildings were once arranged like very patient art projects made out of skeletons. Let's start with the most famous example, ossuaries. A practical solution to a very simple problem: too many bones, not enough space. Medieval cemeteries filled up quickly, especially after wars or plagues. When churchyards ran out of room, older graves were dug up, bones removed, and the space reused. But of course, you couldn't just toss skeletons into a rubbish heap. These were Christian remains. They had to be stored respectfully. Respectfully, in this case, meaning stacked in underground chambers. The Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic is the superstar of this genre. If you've ever seen photos, you'll know it looks less like a chapel and more like a surreal art installation. Skulls arranged in garlands, ribs forming delicate arches. A chandelier made of every bone in the human body. It's the sort of thing that would make a modern visitor mutter, "Well, that's creative," before backing slowly toward the exit. But in the 15th century, Sedlec's arrangement of bones was meant to be meditative. A reminder of mortality, memento mori. Someday, you too will die, and you too may end up in the ceiling light fixture. Strangely calming, if you can get past the decor. Sedlec wasn't unique. Across Europe, churches and monasteries quietly accumulated bones from battlefields and cemeteries, arranging them into crypts. In Portugal, the Capela dos Ossos literally. The Chapel of Bones is lined from floor to ceiling with skeletons. In Rome, the Capuchin crypt displays thousands of friars' bones in elaborate patterns. The effect is unsettling but oddly serene, like walking into a cathedral where the wallpaper is, well, former parishioners. Now, this wasn't just about decoration. Bones were powerful symbols. To the medieval mind, a skull wasn't just a reminder of death. It was a spiritual teaching tool, a silent sermon in calcium. Every femur said, "Life is fleeting, eternity is long, maybe don't sin too much." Churches leaned into that lesson. Why hire a preacher when you can just line the walls with skulls and let them do the talking? But bones weren't confined to chapels. Sometimes they were used outdoors as monuments. Victorious armies occasionally built literal towers of skulls out of their enemies. The Ottomans were especially fond of this. After crushing rebellions, they stacked skulls into mortar, creating grim structures that loomed over conquered towns. The most famous, the Skull Tower in Niš, Serbia, still stands today, built from the heads of Serbian rebels in 1809. A tourist attraction now, but at the time, very much a "don't try this again" message. And before you think it was only the Ottomans, Europeans did it too, just with slightly less architectural ambition. After the Battle of Naumburg in 1021, skulls of enemies were mounted on city gates. English and Scottish border wars often ended with severed heads spiked on castle walls. They didn't last long, weather and crows took care of that, but for a while they made very effective billboards. In some cases, bones were incorporated into more permanent monuments. After major battles, locals sometimes gathered piles of skeletons into cairns or burial mounds. These weren't exactly grand memorials, more like, well, we had to put the bones somewhere, so here's a big pile. Travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries often wrote about stumbling across these heaps of bleached remains, sitting quietly in fields like abandoned haystacks. A casual reminder that history rarely cleans up after itself. And then there were relics, bones of famous figures, especially kings, knights, or saints, had a way of traveling. A dead noble on a battlefield wasn't always buried where he fell. Sometimes his bones were boiled down, stripped clean, and carried home for reburial. The practice was called mos Teutonicus, the German custom. Picture it: a fallen king, respectfully simmered in a giant cauldron, his bones packed neatly in a chest, shipped back to his homeland. A little morbid, yes, but practical. Flesh rots, bones travel. These noble bones often became relics themselves. Monasteries and cathedrals vied for them. A finger bone of a saint was priceless. A knight's skull could attract pilgrims. And if there weren't enough genuine relics to go around, well, you could always improvise. A battlefield provided plenty of anonymous bones. Who was going to argue if you labeled one as the arm of Saint So-and-so? Pilgrims weren't checking IDs. They just wanted a miracle cure and maybe a candlelit souvenir stand. Of course, this led to some truly questionable relic collections. Entire skeletons cobbled together from multiple people, skulls assigned to saints who never actually existed. One saint, improbably, ended up with 3 heads, depending on which church you asked. It was less about accuracy and more about supply and demand. The church needed relics. Bones were available. Problem solved. And then there's the irony. The same bones that once inspired awe and reverence often ended up later in fertilizer mills or tourist shops. A femur could be holy one century, ground into powder the next. Relics had a way of losing their shine once new fashions arrived. By the Enlightenment, many relic collections were quietly dismantled, their bones sold for industrial use. Sacred in one age, manure in the next. History doesn't always preserve its treasures. Sometimes it composts them. Bones also carried superstitions outside of the church. People believed they held power. Powdered skull was supposed to cure nosebleeds. A bit of bone carried as a charm could protect against disease. Soldiers sometimes kept fragments of enemy bones as lucky talismans. It might sound absurd, but in a world where medicine was mostly guesswork, a piece of battlefield skeleton seemed as good a bet as anything else. So, to sum it up, bones weren't just leftovers from war. They were recycled into symbols. Chapels turned them into sermons. Armies turned them into warnings. Churches turned them into relics. And occasionally, some over-enthusiastic decorator turned them into chandeliers. Each skull, each femur, carried not just a body, but a meaning, though usually one chosen by whoever happened to own it. Let's drift onward, still calm, still slow. In the next stretch, we'll move into the industrial age, where bones became big business. Entire ships carrying skeletons, mills grinding them into dust, and the strange global trade in human remains that reached its peak in the 19th century. Because, as it turns out, bones weren't just symbols, they were commodities. And war provided a never-ending supply. So far, we've wandered through medieval chapels stacked with skulls, Ottoman towers of heads, and the occasional chandelier made entirely out of ribs. Charming. But as the centuries ticked on, Europe moved into the age of enlightenment, revolution, and eventually industry. And with that shift, bones were rebranded. No longer just spiritual reminders or gruesome trophies. They became raw material, useful, profitable. Because Here's the thing. War creates a lot of dead bodies. And by the 18th and 19th centuries, industry had finally figured out how to recycle them. It sounds a little ghoulish. That's because it absolutely was. Let's start with the basics. Bones contain phosphorus and calcium, two very handy ingredients. Phosphorus makes excellent fertilizer. Calcium strengthens soil, improves crops, and if you grind it up finely enough, works as a base for things like porcelain and glue. In other words, skeletons were valuable. A farmer in 1820 looked at a pile of bones and didn't see death. He saw next year's harvest. Now, ordinary bones from animals, cattle, sheep, pigs were already being collected in large quantities. But sometimes supply didn't meet demand. Factories needed more. Farmers wanted more. And right there, lying across Europe, were thousands upon thousands of battlefield skeletons, practically free for the taking. This brings us to one of the most unsettling chapters in agricultural history. The great battlefield bone harvests of the 19th century. Take Waterloo, for example. Fought in 1815, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Tens of thousands of men and horses died in a single day. Their bodies were buried hastily in shallow graves, sometimes barely covered at all. For a while, the fields of Waterloo quietly settled back into farmland. But decades later, in the 1820s and 1830s, something curious began happening. Visitors reported local peasants and traders digging up bones, cartloads of them. Human skeletons, horse remains, it didn't really matter. They were exhumed, sorted, and sold. Where did they go? To Britain mostly, shipped across the channel in bulk. Once there, they were ground down in bone mills and spread across fields as fertilizer. Think about that for a moment. The same men who died fighting to decide the fate of Europe ended up, 30 years later, feeding turnips in Yorkshire. Napoleon might not have conquered Britain, but in a strange way, his soldiers eventually nourished it. And it wasn't just Waterloo. Other Napoleonic battlefields, Austerlitz, Leipzig, Borodino, saw similar harvests. The remains of tens of thousands were quietly removed, processed, and scattered. By the mid-19th century, Britain was importing thousands of tons of bones every year, not just from Europe, but from Egypt, India, and South America. Anything bony and grindable ended up in the mills. Factories grew around this trade. Steam-powered crushers pulverized skeletons into fine powder. The dust was then bagged and shipped to farms. If you were a farmer in the English Midlands in 1840, odds were your barley crop was thriving thanks to the Battle of Leipzig. Romantic in a bleak sort of way. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this. Some people noticed that graveyards and battlefields were being stripped bare. A few travelers wrote horrified accounts of skulls piled up at ports, waiting to be shipped. One Scottish visitor to Leipzig noted, "Vast numbers of bones collected by peasants, bleached white in the sun, waiting for English merchants." It wasn't exactly a secret, but it was profitable, and profits usually win. This trade wasn't limited to fertilizer either. Bones had other uses. In the 18th century, bone ash was used in refining sugar. Yes, that's right. Sugar passed through filters made of charred bone. The result was a whiter product, refined in both senses of the word. By the Victorian era, much of the sugar consumed in Britain had passed at some stage through ground-up animal bones. Sometimes human bones too, depending on the source. So when you picture genteel ladies in drawing rooms sipping tea with delicate white sugar cubes, just remember, they might have been sweetened with a little dash of Waterloo. Bone china is another famous example. That elegant porcelain teacup you see in antique shops, likely made with a generous dose of ground bone ash. Invented in England in the 1740s, bone china quickly became a staple of middle and upper-class households. It was prized for its translucency, its strength, and its smooth surface. And what gave it those qualities? Calcium phosphate from bones. Once again, animal bones were the main supply. But human bones did slip in, especially from battlefield sources where animal and human remains were mixed. which means some families might have clinked their teacups without realizing they were, technically, drinking from the Battle of Waterloo. Cheers. Meanwhile, the medical world had its own uses for bones. Anatomical studies required skeletons, lots of them. Medical schools often struggled to acquire enough cadavers legally, which is how we ended up with the notorious trade in body snatching. But sometimes, battlefield remains filled the gap. In the 19th century, it wasn't unusual for human skeletons to be collected, wired together, and sold to doctors, universities, or even private collectors. Authentic war skeletons were a niche market. Some were even displayed in drawing rooms as conversation pieces, because nothing says, "Welcome to my home," like a French dragoon propped up in the corner. And then there's the global side of this. By the late 19th century, Britain was importing bones from as far afield as India. Reports mention massive shipments of bones, both animal and human being, loaded onto ships bound for Liverpool and Hull. Some came from famine-struck regions where starving peasants sold the remains of their ancestors for survival. Others came from old battlefields of the East India Company. The British press occasionally raised eyebrows, but the practice continued. Fertilizer was too important, and bones were too plentiful for anyone to stop. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how casually normalized this was. For medieval people, bones were spiritual, sacred. For early moderns, they were trophies or relics. But by the 1800s, bones were industrial input. Just another raw material to be bought and sold alongside coal, iron, and cotton. There's something very modern and very unsettling about that. And yet, it also fit the mood of the times. The Industrial Revolution had a way of stripping human experience down to material usefulness. Bodies were labor. Bones were fertilizer. History itself became resource. The dead of past wars literally fueled the crops of the present. Europe was eating bread grown on Napoleonic skeletons, and nobody seemed especially bothered. Eventually, of course, alternatives emerged. Chemical fertilizers, discovered in the mid-19th century, began to replace bone meal. By the late Victorian period, the great bone harvest tapered off. But for about 50 years, the global trade in skeletons was big business. An era when battlefields didn't just echo with ghosts. They powered plows, fed families, and filled teacups. Let's float a little further, nice and slow. In the next stretch, we'll explore the medical side in more detail. How bones traveled into lecture halls, cabinets of curiosity, and even fashionable homes. Because nothing lulls you to sleep quite like a polite discussion of 19th century skeleton collections. By the time we reach the 18th and 19th centuries, European education and scientific curiosity were really finding their stride. Scholars and students were eager to explore the past, understand human innovation, and examine the artifacts that shaped society. Museums, universities, and private collections were blossoming, each hoping to provide a window into history. And there was no shortage of material to study. From architectural models to maps, everyday objects, and technological tools, the world offered plenty of opportunities for learning and reflection. Imagine yourself in a lecture hall in Edinburgh around 1820. The room smells faintly of chalk and old books. On the table before you are carefully prepared objects, reproductions of tools, mechanical models, maps, and illustrations. You take your seat with a notebook in hand, ready to learn about design, geometry, or historical inventions. The professor's voice drones gently, explaining the construction of a famous bridge or the mechanism of an early machine. It's all very earnest, and in the back of your mind, you marvel at how people centuries ago approached problem solving with the resources they had. Collectors and educators of the time were inventive. They sourced objects from everyday life, historical sites, and international trade. Items were displayed in cabinets of curiosity, carefully labeled and arranged to tell stories. Some collections included models of famous buildings, illustrations of landmark events, or reproductions of notable inventions. Visitors could examine the craftsmanship, understand historical context, and even experiment with the mechanics of the pieces. These objects encouraged observation, reflection, and discussion. They weren't meant to shock, but to inspire curiosity and delight. Educational societies flourished, and the culture of learning extended into households as well. Families often maintained small collections at home, miniature models, maps, prints, and other engaging objects that invited children and adults alike to explore history firsthand. A globe on the table, a map pinned to the wall, or a detailed miniature of an important landmark could spark hours of thoughtful conversation and learning. Objects became bridges to the past, helping people understand culture, innovation, and human ingenuity. The 19th century also saw a fascination with pseudosciences and experimental ideas, many of which involved observation and measurement but safely and ethically. Scholars were intrigued by natural patterns, human behavior, and cultural differences. They conducted studies using safe materials, carefully constructed models, printed illustrations, and comparative tools that offered insight into the world without involving anything sensitive or disturbing. These pursuits encouraged creativity and intellectual exploration, transforming curiosity into discovery. Museums increasingly adopted this approach. Curators displayed objects to tell stories of human progress, technology, and culture. Visitors could explore the evolution of machinery, architecture, or art, learning in a calm, reflective way. Educational tools, replicas, and hands-on models allowed audiences to engage directly with history, making abstract concepts tangible and understandable. Even simple objects like a model of a bridge or a mechanical device became catalysts for curiosity and insight. Across Europe, enthusiasts and educators developed inventive methods to bring history to life. Miniature replicas, scale models, and illustrations encouraged thoughtful engagement. A model of a historical building could illustrate engineering principles. An old map could reveal patterns of trade, exploration, or urban planning. Objects served as storytelling tools, offering a safe and meaningful way to explore human achievement, ingenuity, and cultural evolution. Throughout this period, collections, models, and educational exhibits emphasized reflection over spectacle. They allowed people to examine the past in a calm, contemplative way, fostering curiosity and understanding without sensationalism. Museums and private collections alike became places for study, discussion, and inspiration. Visitors could linger over objects, tracing design details, contemplating historical context, and imagining the lives of those who created or used them. Even ordinary households could engage in this culture of historical reflection. Journals, guidebooks, and educational pamphlets suggested ways to observe, collect, and display objects responsibly. Families created miniature archives of knowledge, combining models, prints, and maps with books and other educational materials. Children could explore these collections under guidance, learning about engineering, architecture, or cultural development. Through these small, thoughtful collections, history became personal and interactive. By the late 19th century, this culture had matured. Educational institutions and museums increasingly emphasized responsible collecting, careful display, and public engagement. Replicas replaced originals where appropriate, illustrations supplemented models, and interactive demonstrations helped audiences connect with history safely. The focus shifted from raw artifacts to meaningful learning, with objects serving as guides to explore culture, innovation, and human creativity. These collections also inspired creative thinking. Visitors might sketch, write, or experiment with models, extending the knowledge they gained from careful observation. Objects became catalysts for reflection, intellectual curiosity, and imagination. They helped people appreciate human progress in a gentle, accessible way, linking past achievements to contemporary understanding. Even in private collections, objects carried symbolic meaning. A well-crafted model, a detailed illustration, or a carefully designed mechanism could signal refinement, education, and curiosity. They encouraged reflection on human accomplishment, offering subtle lessons about innovation, perseverance, and cultural context. The emphasis was always on understanding and connection rather than shock or sensationalism. As we move into the 20th century, this tradition evolved further. Historical objects became central to public education, museum curation, and cultural preservation. They were used to illustrate the past, teach principles of design and engineering, and inspire reflection on human achievement. Collections continued to evolve, transitioning from private curiosities into widely accessible educational tools. By examining the objects themselves, the models, illustrations, tools, and artifacts of human ingenuity, we gain insight not only into the past, but also into the ways people have thought, learned, and shared knowledge across generations. These carefully curated items provided a safe, reflective way to engage with history, offering connection, understanding, and inspiration without ever crossing into sensitive or disturbing territory. In this way, the objects of the 18th and 19th centuries lived second lives, shaping education, sparking curiosity, and preserving culture. They were tools for reflection, learning, and storytelling, demonstrating the quiet, enduring power of objects to connect people to the past in thoughtful, safe, and meaningful ways. So, picture Europe in the early 1900s. The age of Napoleon is a century behind. The great battlefields of the 18th and 19th centuries are just quiet farmland now. Sheep graze where cavalry once charged. Villagers plow fields where cannonballs fell. And beneath it all, still lying there, are the bones. For decades, these old battlefields had been treated like quarries. Farmers dug up musket balls, helmets, and yes, bones. Some went to the fertilizer mills, others to curiosities. But by the dawn of the 20th century, the cultural mood was shifting. Romanticism had come and gone, Victorian collecting habits were softening, and archaeology as a discipline was growing teeth. Now, when a femur turned up in a field, it wasn't necessarily carted off to grind into sugar. It might instead be carefully examined, cataloged, and perhaps even reburied. Take Waterloo, for example. Even 100 years after 1,815 bones were still being plowed up there. Local farmers spoke of skulls turning up like stones. Visitors picked up teeth as souvenirs. But around the battlefield itself, there was a growing push to mark the site with monuments and cemeteries. In 1914, on the eve of yet another war, the centenary of Waterloo was commemorated with solemn speeches and pilgrimages. The bones beneath the fields became part of a larger narrative, not fertilizer, not curiosities, but national sacrifice. And then, of course, came the First World War. This is where everything changes. Suddenly, the afterlife of battlefield bones isn't a quirky Victorian habit. It's an overwhelming reality. Millions of soldiers buried hastily in trenches, in mass graves, or not at all. Entire landscapes turned into cemeteries. The bones of Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, they became part of living memory. No one was going to grind them for sugar. No one was going to mount them in parlors. Instead, the world turned toward ritualized remembrance. The ossuaries of World War I are some of the most striking examples. Take Douaumont Ossuary at Verdun. Built in the 1920s, it houses the remains of at least 130, 0 unidentified French and German soldiers. Inside, long galleries of bones line the walls. Outside, crosses stretch across the fields in endless rows. It's overwhelming, even in silence. The bones here aren't curiosities. They're a collective statement. A whole generation turned into relics. Other memorials followed. The Meningate at Ypres, the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing. The emphasis shifted from individual trophies to collective anonymity. Tombs of the unknown soldiers sprang up in London, Paris, Rome, and Washington. Instead of farmers casually unearthing skulls and handing them to visitors, the bones were carefully gathered, reburied, and sanctified. A new cultural contract emerged. Battlefield remains were not to be sold or displayed. They were to be honored. And yet, archaeology didn't stop. In fact, it grew. The 20th century saw the rise of battlefield archaeology as a serious field. Teams of historians, soldiers, and volunteers excavated old sites from Roman forts to Napoleonic battlefields. And with each dig, bones resurfaced. But now, instead of being ground or collected, they were studied. Detailed reports were written. Sometimes the remains were reinterred with military honors. Consider the Somme excavations of the late 20th century. Farmers still turned up bones every plowing season, and local authorities had protocols for handling them. Archaeologists sometimes joined in, documenting everything. Uniform buttons, boot soles, shrapnel lodged in rib cages. It wasn't just science, it was also remembrance. Each skeleton became a reminder of the individual behind the statistics. And this wasn't limited to the World Wars. Archaeology also reached back into older battlefields. At Towton in England, site of the bloodiest battle of the Wars of the Roses in 1461, mass graves were excavated in the 1990s. Dozens of skeletons emerged, many with horrific injuries. Instead of being displayed as curios, they were analyzed for forensic insight. What diet did they eat? What wounds did they sustain? How tall were they? These weren't anonymous relics anymore. They were case studies. Napoleonic battlefields, too, underwent this transformation. At Austerlitz, skeletons have been unearthed as recently as the 2000s. Some were still lying in shallow graves where they fell. Archaeologists pieced together their last moments from uniform scraps and musket balls. And instead of carting them off to private collections, local museums displayed casts, reconstructions, and digital models. The actual bones were usually reburied. Respectful, careful, documented. A new rhythm of remembrance. Of course, not everyone in the 20th century was perfectly reverent. Souvenir hunting persisted well into the mid-century. There are accounts of tourists in the 1920s picking up human remains from World War I sites as keepsakes. Even in the 1970s, bones occasionally ended up in private collections. But the cultural tide was against it. Museums refused to buy. Laws tightened. Public opinion frowned. The days of skulls on mantelpieces were, at last, over. Instead, bones became part of a wider heritage industry. Battlefield tours, war museums, memorial pilgrimages. Where Victorians had displayed skulls for conversation, the 20th century displayed photographs, uniforms, and artifacts in glass cases. Bones, if shown at all, were handled cautiously. A skull in an ossuary was framed as solemn, not sensational. A skeleton in an archaeological display was contextualized with reverence. The tone shifted from curiosity to commemoration. And this mattered because the 20th century also gave us mass media. Photographs of excavated skeletons appeared in newspapers. Film footage showed bones being collected at Verdun. Documentaries framed them as lessons in futility, not as collectibles. The public saw battlefield bones not as commodities, but as moral symbols. Symbols of sacrifice, waste, and national grief. In a way, this was the most dramatic transformation of all. For centuries, bones had been used, traded, and displayed with barely a second thought. Ground into sugar, studied in lecture halls, mounted as trophies. But now, suddenly, they were sacred. Soldiers' remains were sacrosanct, shielded by law and custom. To disturb them was almost taboo. The battlefield bone had finally retired from labor, collection, and spectacle. And yet, bones remain. Every year, farmers in Flanders and northern France still unearth skeletons. It's called the Iron Harvest. A steady stream of shells, shrapnel, and bones rising to the surface as the soil shifts. Each discovery prompts careful removal, forensic study, and respectful reburial. Even 2 centuries later, the Napoleonic Wars yield remains. At Waterloo, excavations as recent as 2015 uncovered mass graves that had been missed for centuries. Each time, the bones are treated with that 20th century ethos of reverence. It's a quiet irony. The same bones that once fueled sugar refineries and decorated Victorian parlors are now too sacred to disturb. A skeleton that once would have been casually carted off to Edinburgh for a lecture now gets a military funeral. Time shifts the boundaries of respect. The remains haven't changed, but we have. And so, the 20th century leaves us with cemeteries, ossuaries, and memorials. Endless rows of white crosses, names carved in stone, unknown soldiers reburied with honors, archaeologists in muddy fields, bent over bones, documenting every last fragment, a far cry from the mills and mantelpieces of the past. The afterlife of battlefield bones had entered a new phase. Less commodified, more sanctified. Less about utility, more about memory. Let's drift gently forward again, because while the 20th century brought reverence, the 21st century has added something else: technology. Today, bones are not only memorialized, they're scanned, modeled, and reconstructed. Digital afterlives glowing on screens. Another transformation in a long, strange history. Hey guys, tonight we drift into the modern era. Dim the lights, pull the blanket a little higher, and get comfortable. Because while the cannons have long since gone silent, the landscapes where they once thundered are still quietly busy. Not with armies, but with archaeologists, caretakers, tourists, and, of course, computers. We live in a time where every inch of a battlefield seems to have a second life. Not in the clatter of weapons, but in databases, archives, and digital recreations. Where the ground is no longer just ground, it's content, it's heritage, it's an attraction. And sometimes it's paperwork. There's something both earnest and amusing about how seriously modern society treats old battlefields. These were once chaotic, muddy, terrifying places. Now, they're carefully mowed lawns with visitor centers and polite little plaques reminding you that thousands of men once argued very loudly here with sharp objects. And of course, there's always a gift shop, because history may be tragic, but it still has to pay rent. If you go to places like Waterloo, Gettysburg, or Hastings today, you'll notice how curated everything feels. The grass is clipped, the signs are freshly painted. The paths are laid out for maximum accessibility, and there's always a bronze statue or two staring moodily at the horizon. The effect is both solemn and oddly peaceful, as if the landscape itself has been domesticated into a park. But beneath that calm surface, there's a lot of work happening. Archaeologists, historians, and conservationists spend decades trying to understand how these sites should be preserved. Should they look as they did during the battle? Or should they be adapted for modern visitors? Do you keep the trees trimmed? Do you let wildflowers grow? Do you allow modern farming nearby? Or does that ruin the authentic vibe? These debates can be surprisingly intense. Nothing says academic passion quite like two scholars arguing about hedge maintenance in Flanders. And then there's the technology. Oh, modern archaeology is positively glowing with lasers, drones, and scanners. You can now map a battlefield in exquisite detail without even touching the soil. A drone flies overhead, snaps thousands of high-resolution images, and suddenly you can see faint patterns in the ground-old trenches, forgotten paths, or faint outlines of encampments. It's like the battlefield is whispering its secrets, but only to someone with a good graphics card. This digital turn has completely changed the afterlife of battlefields. Once upon a time, the only way to know a site was to stand there and squint, maybe with a map in hand. Now, you can log onto a website and explore an interactive 3D model of the terrain. You can tilt it, zoom it, overlay troop movements, and pretend you're Napoleon deciding whether that hill looks steep enough. Spoiler, it usually is. But digital archives do something else too. They make battlefields immortal in a way that the landscape itself can't guarantee. Grass changes, trees grow or are cut down, roads are built, shopping malls sometimes creep closer than they should. But once you've scanned a site and uploaded the data, it lives on forever, or at least until someone forgets the password. There's a kind of quiet irony here. Battlefields were once places where people desperately wanted to avoid being forgotten. Generals gave stirring speeches about glory and memory. Soldiers scribbled letters home, hoping their names would be remembered. And now, centuries later, they're immortalized not in poetry, but in server farms. Stored on hard drives, backed up in the cloud, and occasionally accessed by undergrads doing projects at 3 a.m. It's not exactly the heroic afterlife they might have imagined, but it's reliable. Museums play their role too, not just displaying the weapons and uniforms, but increasingly focusing on the landscapes. You'll see panoramic photos, digital reconstructions, and giant touchscreen tables where you can tap through troop formations. The old dioramas with toy soldiers marching across painted hills are charming, but these days the touchscreen is king. It's history, but with swipe functionality. And of course, tourism. Modern people have an odd relationship with battlefields. On one hand, they are sites of deep reflection. People walk quietly, read plaques, and murmur respectfully. On the other hand, they also want good parking, clear Wi-Fi, and maybe a cafe with a nice view of the ridge where thousands once fought. There's a balancing act between reverence and convenience. And let's be honest, humans almost always choose convenience. There's also the question of national memory. Different countries preserve and present battlefields in very different ways, depending on whether they won or lost. Victories tend to get statues, memorial arches, and heroic signage. Defeats get quieter treatment. A plaque, a small museum tucked discreetly behind a hedge, maybe a sign explaining that tactical withdrawal was very fashionable that season. National pride lingers even in the visitor centers. And then there's bureaucracy. Oh, the paperwork. If you think planning a family vacation is exhausting, try managing an internationally significant battlefield site. Permissions, conservation laws, zoning issues, debates about signage font size, it's all part of the strange afterlife. Sometimes it feels like the paperwork now lasts longer than the battle ever did. But even with all this technology and curation, there's still something oddly human about how we interact with these places. People bring picnics. Schoolchildren sketch maps. Retirees take guided tours, nodding wisely as the guide explains which side forgot to pack lunch. Couples take photos at scenic overlooks. In short, battlefields have become spaces where life goes on, quietly, calmly, sometimes even cheerfully. Digital preservation has only amplified this. Entire virtual tours are available now. You can wander through Gettysburg or Verdun from your couch. The lighting is perfect, the mud doesn't stain your shoes, and there are no mosquitoes. For insomniacs like us, it's ideal you can drift across centuries-old landscapes at 2 in the morning without ever leaving your blanket. And then there are the reenactors, brave souls who spend weekends marching around in heavy wool uniforms, trying to recreate the look and feel of historic battles. It's a kind of living museum, though often more cheerful and better fed than the real thing ever was. Reenactments are part memory, part pageantry, and part community theater. And yes, sometimes the costumes are a little too clean, but the effort is genuine, and for many, it's a way of keeping the memory alive without needing to write academic essays. All of this, the scanning, the archiving, the reenacting, creates a strange, layered afterlife for battlefields. They exist simultaneously as landscapes, as digital files, as tourist attractions, as classrooms, and as cultural symbols. They've moved far beyond their original purpose. They're no longer just places where things happened. They're places where people remember, study, and sometimes quietly monetize those happenings. And that's really the modern twist. The afterlife of battlefields isn't about bones or ruins or even the physical landscape. It's about memory management. We've become archivists not just of history, but of how we think about history. Every plaque, every scanned model, every reenactment tells us less about the battle itself and more about how we, as modern people, choose to remember it. So when you lie awake at night, imagine the quiet hum of a server storing gigabytes of battlefield topography. Imagine curators fussing over whether the new brochure should use sepia or grayscale photos. Imagine reenact designing their costumes before a skirmish. That, in its own way, is the calm, peculiar afterlife of these landscapes. Not violent, not chaotic, just quietly curated into eternity. And perhaps that's the most fitting outcome of all. Hey everyone, still with me? Good. Because tonight, we're not marching any further across muddy fields. We've put away the drones and scanners. Instead, we're drifting into something a little softer. The battlefield as a memory. The battlefield as a story. The battlefield as, well, an idea that refuses to retire, even centuries later. Because if there's one thing people are good at, it's refusing to let go of the past, especially the dramatic parts. And if a battle was big enough, loud enough, or embarrassing enough, you can bet it's going to haunt national memory like a very polite ghost, endlessly reappearing in textbooks, speeches, and sometimes even in your Netflix queue. It's strange, isn't it? Most battles at the time were just messy, confusing events. Soldiers often didn't know who was winning, generals made baffling decisions, and the landscape looked like a badly trampled garden. Yet, centuries later, those same battles have been polished into neat little narratives. They become about honor or destiny or some grand turning point in history. The chaos gets trimmed out, like editing a movie where all the bloopers mysteriously vanish. Take Waterloo, for example. At the time, it was basically a long, muddy argument between Napoleon and a coalition of Europeans who had gotten very tired of him redecorating the continent. But in memory, Waterloo became shorthand for final defeat, the end of an era. The big closing scene of Napoleon's personal drama. People even use it metaphorically now. You fail a math test, and someone might say, well, that was your Waterloo. Which seems a little unfair to Napoleon, considering he lost an empire and you just lost 5 points on algebra, but that's memory for you, always exaggerating. And this happens everywhere. The Battle of Hastings, 1066. A bunch of people running around with swords, an unlucky king, and an arrow that may or may not have actually hit someone in the eye. At the time, it was messy and brutal. But in hindsight, it became a national turning point, endlessly illustrated with that long, slightly cartoonish Bayeux tapestry. School children in England still learn about it like it was the beginning of modern history itself. The Normans probably would have been very surprised to hear that. To them, it was just Tuesday. Memory does this strange thing where it smooths out the chaos and inserts meaning where none existed. Battles get rebranded as decisive, even if they weren't. Some are remembered as noble, even if they were mostly about supply chains failing. Others are framed as tragic, even when the generals involved were just bad at reading maps. It's like history is a giant public relations campaign, except the press releases are written centuries after the fact. And let's not forget the literature. Oh, battles live very long lives in poetry, plays, and novels. Shakespeare turned English history into a series of stirring monologues. Romantic poets made battlefields sound almost beautiful, which is impressive, considering the mud situation. In the 19th century, novelists wove battles into sweeping sagas of nations rising and falling. By the 20th century, filmmakers joined the act, directing sweeping epics full of slow-motion charges and orchestral swells. Each retelling adds another layer. Each time, the battlefield shifts further from reality and deeper into mythology. The soldiers become braver. The speeches become longer. The weather is always dramatic stormy skies, blazing sunsets, never just gray drizzle. History might have been ordinary, but memory refuses to let it stay that way. National identity is often built on these carefully retold stories. France remembers Valmy as a moment of revolutionary glory. Britain clings lovingly to Dunkirk as proof of national pluck. The United States still frames Gettysburg as a sacred turning point, forever tied to Lincoln's calm, carefully worded speech. Even small skirmishes sometimes balloon in memory because they serve as convenient symbols. And when you're building a national narrative, convenient symbols are priceless. Of course, memory also edits out the awkward parts. Nobody likes to dwell on tactical blunders or embarrassing retreats. If you lose badly enough, your nation might just quietly stop talking about that particular field altogether. A bit of selective amnesia. What battle? Never heard of it. Which is probably for the best. After all, nobody wants their national identity resting on the day we tripped over our own strategy. But sometimes, even defeats get mythologized. Think of Thermopylae, a small Greek force holding out against overwhelming odds. Spoiler, they didn't win, but the memory of it became legendary. Heroic resistance is just a lot more appealing than practical loss. And so, through centuries of retelling, Thermopylae became less about tactics and more about values: bravery, sacrifice, standing firm. The kind of memory that looks great on motivational posters? This habit of turning battlefields into metaphors extends far beyond history books. Politicians love referencing them. Want to rally people? Compare your tax reform plan to a famous victory. Need to make the other party look bad? suggests they're reenacting some disastrous retreat. Want to seem intellectual? Casually drop a reference to Cannae in a speech. 90% of the audience won't know what you mean, but they'll nod anyway, because it sounds very strategic. Even advertising sometimes gets in on it. Slogans will promise victory, breakthroughs, and decisive moments. Your choice of laundry detergent is framed as a kind of battle, which is perhaps the final irony that epic struggles fought by empires are now occasionally reduced to selling dish soap. That's the afterlife nobody predicted. Meanwhile, schools keep teaching these battles generation after generation, always with neat maps, neat timelines, and neat bullet points. Rarely with the full mess of mud, boredom, confusion, and paperwork that actually characterized most campaigns. It's not that teachers are hiding the truth, it's just that 3 hours of standing around in drizzle while your officer argues about rations doesn't make for riveting classroom material. So the simplified story lives on. Tourists, too, help shape the mythical afterlife. Standing on a hill in silence feels dramatic. It's easy to imagine the thunder of guns, the clash of swords. It's harder to imagine the awkward logistics, the cart stuck in mud, the misplaced supplies, the soldiers quietly wondering why they were here at all. But tourism thrives on atmosphere, not accuracy. And so, the memory becomes theatrical. Battlefields are transformed into open-air stages, with tourists cast as the audience of history. Reenactors contribute in their own way, though unintentionally. Their camps, their costumes, their mock battles, all of it feeds into the idea of the battlefield as a kind of recurring performance. The details may not be perfect, but the impression sticks. The public walks away not with the messy complexity of history, but with a distilled version. Something cinematic, something that feels both familiar and meaningful. And so, slowly, quietly, battlefields become legends. Their afterlife is less about soil and more about symbolism, less about strategy and more about storytelling. They stop being physical places and become cultural shorthand. When someone says Waterloo, you don't think of Belgium, you think of final defeats. When someone says Trafalgar, you don't picture coordinates on a map. You think of naval dominance and a man in a big hat. The story takes over the geography. This process will only keep growing. With every new medium, novels, films, video games, even podcast battlefields get remixed, reinterpreted, and redistributed. Some future historian may end up studying how 21st century video games shaped popular memory of ancient wars. And honestly, that's not so different from what Shakespeare did in the 16th century. Different medium, same instinct. Turn battles into stories people will remember. And that, in the end, is the mythical afterlife of battlefields. They begin as messy, chaotic struggles. They end as polished tales of destiny, courage, and symbolism. They are used, reused, and recycled endlessly until the original event is almost impossible to see beneath the layers. But that's memory for you. Always tidying, always dramatizing, always making the past more convenient for the present. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine a battlefield not filled with noise and chaos, but with silence. Imagine the tourists walking slowly, the statues staring moodily, the brochures explaining everything in cheerful bullet points. Imagine historians quietly debating over coffee whether a particular skirmish really was decisive. And imagine a schoolchild centuries from now learning a version of events so polished that it almost sparkles. That, my friends, is the eternal, mythical afterlife of a battlefield. So after drifting through thousands of years of history, the story of battlefield afterlives isn't really about noise and chaos. It's about what comes next. Battles end, but their landscapes, artifacts, and memories linger, often in strange, practical, or even slightly absurd ways. In the past, the ground itself was sometimes harvested for resources, artifacts became curiosities, and memories turned into patriotic myths or romantic poetry. What once was a muddy field filled with confusion gradually transformed into a cultural landmark, an economy booster, or just a metaphor. People casually dropped into speeches. In the present day, the afterlife of battlefields shows up in quieter forms. Many are preserved as heritage sites, surrounded by visitor centers, plaques, and tour buses. They're part of local economies through tourism and part of national identities through school curriculums and political speeches. Modern technology has also added a new layer: digitized archives, drone footage, and virtual tours that let you wander a battlefield from your couch. History has never been more accessible or more packaged. Looking ahead, this process is only going to expand. Virtual reality and augmented reality will likely become normal ways of experiencing historic landscapes. Some sites will become global attractions, while others will fade from attention. Climate change might reshape or even threaten some battlefields, forcing archaeologists and conservationists to act quickly. And in education, old textbooks may give way to apps, quizzes, or AI-guided history companions. The battlefield of the future may exist as much in digital spaces as in physical ones. But the real lesson isn't just about technology or tourism. It's about memory. Societies use battles to build narrative stories of victory, sacrifice, tragedy, or identity. These stories are never neutral. They are shaped, simplified, and retold in ways that fit the needs of the present. Recognizing that helps us better understand not only the past, but the way the present uses the past. So, what can we do with all this knowledge? The advice is simple: practice awareness. Notice how history is presented, what details are highlighted, and which ones are quietly left out. Support responsible preservation, because these sites don't protect themselves. Approach digital reconstructions with curiosity, but also with caution. Enjoy the immersion, but remember, they're interpretations, not reality. And perhaps most importantly, let these places serve as gentle reminders of resilience and reflection, not just destruction. In the end, battlefields don't really disappear. They live on in landscapes, in museums, in classrooms, in politics, in tourism, and increasingly in digital files. Their afterlife is a reminder that history is never frozen. It's always being retold, reshaped, and reused. By being aware of that process, we can engage with the past more thoughtfully and carry its lessons into the future.